and welcome to My Security TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with My Security Media, and today we're going to be joined by Dr. Tom Winston, Director of Intelligence with Dragos. We're going to be looking at assessing risk in ICS environments, the IT/OT sort of landscape as we do, and also be touching on ransomware and also the insider threat and the general risk assessment process that we'll go through. Tom's got a very interesting background in the intelligence community, so looking forward to speaking to Tom. And without further ado, we'll bring on Dr. Tom Winston, Director of Intelligence with Dragos. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me, Chris. Appreciate the opportunity to have this nice conversation.
Great. We did speak a few weeks ago. So like I said, I've been looking forward to speaking to you. And Dragos is in the IT/OT environment, particularly on the OT, looking at visibility. I think there's a couple of ways we can go, either your background or maybe introduction to Dragos as well. And I think that's where your role as Director of Intelligence converge. Maybe start off with Dragos and what you particularly do, because you do have that threat intel role as well, right?
Yes, that's correct. Dragos focuses primarily on ICS OT environment, asset visibility, and asset management. So really, we look at the other part of the enterprise after IT. We're always interested in IT, and IT definitely matters for us. But we're much more interested in how IT is connected to and interacts with the ICS environments or the operational technology OT environments in the organization. My role.
Yep. Sorry. I was going to say and your role there with the intel, because there's it's amazing in the last couple of years the increasing discussions around OT. It's increasing with its prevalence.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The conversation's been hard to start, and I know when I was serving in the United States intelligence community, I was the person who was stuck. I put that in very loose quotes with the account, and I had been pursuing cyber threat actors in various geographic parts of the world prior to that, both online and in person sometimes, but mostly online. And really, when that account was handed to me, I was excited and afraid, and I realized very quickly that there was a lot to do. I still think there is a lot to do, and certainly having these conversations, I think, is a great way to sort of get that out there. I am by no means the only expert. There are many experts in this area, a growing number of experts, although I think that may be a bit of selection bias on my part, because I work with these people every day, so it seems like there's a lot. In terms of cybersecurity, we're a real small group of folks, so tends to be a small community, and everybody tends to sort of help each other. Certainly Dragos, that's our goal, safeguarding civilization, all civilizations anywhere. And really we approach this with the humility that we're always learning, and there's a lot to do in this area.
Maybe the change in the definition of OT environments over time, I suppose most of us would be thinking about power, chemical plants, and the like, but the changes that you would have seen over your time and the spread. I see OT environments and the definition of critical infrastructure has changed over the years. We're now looking at sort of real-time supply chains. Even food distribution would be considered critical infrastructure today. Yeah, just the change in the OT environment in your time and how it's viewed, or the view is changing.
So a couple changes. First of all, OT is not new. It's been around for a very long time, but OT connected to IT is a relatively new thing. So a couple things that have happened. I think a couple years, we'll say go back 7, 8, 9 years, there was very little understanding about how IT would eventually or was already impacting OT environments. So having the conversation with the interested, shareholder, stakeholder folks really was hard at first, because you would sit down and you talk to. I would sit down with the United States Coast Guard and I'd say, we should talk about port security, and they'd look at me and they'd say, why do we want to talk about port security? Well, because it's connected to your IT systems. So things like that was sort of that was the beginning. Certainly, the pandemic has caused a whole host of other issues, mostly stemming from work from home arrangements that required organizations in a very quick fashion to organize and set up IT that allowed people to work remotely from home typically. This is where things got really murky and messy. I think there's been a couple incidents in the past year or two even that have sort of shown this that this is a real threat, real problem. If we take a step back from sort of the common, what I refer to as is the common person's critical infrastructure, and we look at what governments are doing, research on this. You mentioned critical infrastructure protection. Almost every country in the world has a formalized definition of and process forward, plan forward for protecting critical infrastructure. So how they define critical infrastructure, of course, may differ. And ICS and Operational Technology is really interesting because it's only a small part of critical infrastructure. Recently had a conversation with some colleagues, including the CEO of Dragos, Mr. Robert Lee, and he had mentioned, we were talking about the 911 infrastructure because it's connected to telecommunications, but it turns out that there's very little OT actually involved in that part of our critical infrastructure. Even though it's hugely important, it's not an operational technology concern right now anyway. So just little things like that, a lot of nuance to sort of the ICS OT world that I think it's almost easier if you're looking at IT security because there's just a lot more of it. But on the other hand, maybe that makes it more difficult. Maybe that makes the job that Dragos does, much easier.
I think one of the areas in OT is the visibility, and that's where Dragos comes in. Maybe just go through what maybe termed the secret sauce of Dragos. What's the actual product that you provide or sort of coming to market that might differentiate yourselves?
So Dragos provides an endpoint solution that is not just a static, we designed it once and we sent it out the door and we're never going to touch it again endpoint solution for ICS environments, operational technology environments, but it's a solution that is continuously being updated. And as our tireless intel hunters, intel analysts, adversary hunters, sometimes we call them, are searching for these, this activity out in the wild. When we find it, that information is included into sometimes in real time. Sometimes it takes a couple of weeks, but really into that solution, so that as the threats occur, with cyber threat intelligence, the issue always is we have a timeliness issue. So we're always looking to get those corrections into the system as soon as we possibly can. So that's something that Dragos does, from the engineering standpoint. I think the other thing that we do that's really pretty amazing, besides for attracting really some of the best talent that is in the sector, in this area, in this niche of cybersecurity, we do have an intelligence team that is tirelessly looking for solutions to some of these problems. We're trying to identify problem areas before they become problem areas. As anybody in intelligence will tell you, it's very difficult to predict the future. It may be easier, in fact, to predict the weather than it is to predict, the future in cybersecurity in any area. So much less ICS OT. So that's the one thing that that Dragos has, I think, that's really amazing. I mean, everybody at the company is amazing in what they do, and certainly it's all very, very important for the company as a whole and safeguarding civilization as a whole. But really, the intelligence products we offer, I think, are becoming their own sort of niche product. There are other companies that do this, certainly, but we have a team of people who are ready to answer questions, ready and willing, actually, to answer questions and to jump in and roll up their sleeves and go to the source, go to the factories, go to the industry, go to the manufacturing plant, go to the nuclear power plant. It doesn't matter. There's groups of people ready and waiting to do that if there's a breach or a suspected breach. So I think that's something that really adds value to what Dragos does as a whole.
I suppose one of the things I wanted to cover out, every site or facility will need to assess its own risk. And there's a couple of ways you can go about that, is either sort of threat or consequence as well. And that's what's slightly different with OT environments. You're dealing with the both, but the actual consequence is often much greater than, say, a data breach or a data loss, whereas OT environments can have impacts on lives and human safety. And we've actually seen this just recently. We're going to touch on ransomware as a potential risk. And we have seen, 2021, here we are in as we start off on 2022, we've already had, major attack between Ukraine and Russia, cyber attack, possibly pre-war. But again, the first move is a cyber attack. And just this week, the ransomware Revil group has been arrested reportedly in Russia as well. So Russia's always central in terms of this space. But I think that's where we're coming back to assessing the risk in OT environments and the ICS environment. Where would you tend to go towards threat or consequence? And I take it that changes depending on the type of infrastructure that we're dealing with?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, threat or consequence. Really, you said it already. The consequence kind of justifies the need to investigate first the threat. There is possibility for destruction and physical damage and even harm to human life, certainly much different than taking a server offline. You also mentioned the Russia-Ukraine activity that has been happening with the websites down, denial of service, whatever. This is definitely a typical Russian tactics. Certainly in 2008, before they invaded Georgia, they did exactly the same thing. Typically, that country will use that as a force multiplier. If we look at a different country, like China, for instance, PRC, they're much more clever about how they do their research. They'll send academics over here to take jobs in research universities, and they seem to be perfectly fine, perfectly normal. There is a really good book about this actually that has been written recently, and I'm not trying to sell the book or anything, but it's called Spy Schools, and it talks about the whole espionage sort of insider threat, what I would refer to as an insider threat at American universities. Sometimes, the folks in China, they're just like in any other country in the world. They have a lot of really bright, very highly skilled engineers, and maybe they get sent over here to do legitimate, I guess, anodyne research, or maybe they get sent over here to do research that has another meaning or another effort in mind. So it's just a very interesting sort of spectrum of threat, and it's difficult to know the depth and sort of, I guess, qualitative measure of that threat. Sometimes the consequence is easy to understand, right? We know that if if some nation state is scanning everybody's OT environment, then yeah, we might have a problem. They might be doing research and development. Research and development is a critical component in nation state activities regarding sort of conducting cyber activity, because not everybody understands how the controller works or how the PLC is coded. So there are groups of people who are working on this stuff 24/7. So it's a really interesting comment about threat versus consequence. I think with ICS in operational technology environments, we're always really worried about the physics of it. The IT, taking a server offline, taking a website down, corrupting a database, these are bad things, obviously, but actually causing a process to fail or causing a safety system to fail, this is a whole different sort of thing. It takes that cyber threat to a very, very different level.
Well, that's the contrast between IT and OT, is the safety, reliability, and productivity versus confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. How and that neither of the two really meet in the middle, really. How do you deal with that? And the other sort of area I wanted to cover is, we just talked about sort of nation state, foreign intelligence. We've just had a Chinese spy identified by MI5 in the UK. and the convergence with OT coming online and being sort of connected or accessible via the internet. It's almost a perfect storm, just in terms of the geopolitics of the world, the sort of the critical nature and the connectivity of OT environments. Is that hence why the conversation's increasing? And one area we were going to cover is the human and OSINT area. From an intelligence viewpoint, this is a very interesting time to be in the intelligence community, is it not?
Yeah, I would definitely argue that it gets scarier every day in some way. Yeah, it's so the traditional spy tradecraft involved somebody wearing a cloak and a hat, showing up at somebody's doorstep and saying, "Hey, if you get me this information, I'll give you $1,000." Right? That's the traditional human approach. But now it's easier, right? We don't need to send that person out. There doesn't need to be the recruitment of the asset for the spy handler. It doesn't have to happen. It's all online. There's all this connectivity today. There's all this availability of data. It changes the whole paradigm for human. Now, that's one side of it. The other side of it is the insider threat. I've mentioned this before, that when we look at looking at sort of companies, and by the way, a lot of that information is available online, and sometimes it's available online by personal design, right? People will post LinkedIn profiles, they'll post Facebook profiles, Twitter handles, and they'll put lots of detail in there that maybe shouldn't be in there. And so there is a perfect storm. We have all of this capability to find all this information about people. I mean, with LinkedIn, or we'll say VKontakte, which is the Russian version of Facebook, that saves people looking for who works at this organization. It saves all that time. It could have taken 3 to 6 months before, getting visas and getting a person over there, and the person had to appear suddenly at this location, or maybe take a job there, sweeping the floor. Who knows? But basically now it's much easier with open source intelligence, or OSINT, to sort of find a lot of this information on people. And I think people are torn. Sometimes people in the intelligence profession are very torn. They're torn between, do I have a lot in my personal profile, or do I put nothing there? Because I can tell you personally, if I found somebody that had no social media, that was a red flag to me. That's almost as much a red flag as finding a person saying, "Yeah, I studied at the Cryptological Institute," or whatever. Right. So you have these two sides of the spectrum. Do I overshare? Or do I not share, enough, or do I share just the right amount to keep my network going, and to actually use LinkedIn, for instance, for what it's for, which is to develop those networks, and it's really to develop networks of knowledge more than I think anything else. But knowledge works in every direction, right? I mean, it can be for the good, it can be for the bad. So you just don't know sometimes.
Do you find it's almost going full circle to where it was maybe 30 years ago, where corporate security had quite a strong role, and then it sort of died off, and it became a cost center, but now it's returning? Because what we just talked about there, open source intel and human intelligence, it requires some more security awareness training now, because of that insider threat. And the insider threat might be a motivated, but it can also be a complacent actor as well in that IT and OT environment. And you're talking about, you might be talking about a sort of a process engineer who doesn't understand cybersecurity and who is complacent in that context is an insider threat. So do you find it raises challenges for security awareness and maintaining that security awareness?
I think it definitely does, because even using tools, IT-based tools like sort of developing behavior profiles on a person based on what they do during the day, using their IT, that's not good enough, really. And it would be weird if corporate security was following you around every day, in your daily, while you get a cup of coffee, or when you go to the water cooler, whether you go get a drink or something, or a lunch or a meal. That's really complicated now, right? It's complicated by the very thing that we're doing right now. I'm speaking to you from my home. So yeah, it's extremely complicated now, as far from the standpoint of because a lot of IT security functions look at their assets, which are their computers that they give to people, laptops, and they say, okay, we got to make sure these are secure. Let's focus on securing the machines. Let's focus on, register machines in some system like JAMF, for instance. Make sure everybody's got the same software. Make sure they're not downloading things they shouldn't be. That's one small dimension of it. But yeah, absolutely. What about the people? What are they doing in their off time? And obviously, this is a challenge that no organization really wants to consider too greatly, because it's costly, right, to follow people and to conduct passive surveillance, and this is time intensive and very much money intensive. So looking at insiders from a work from home or a remote company is an incredibly complex decision calculus. I have to, in my next insider threat paper, I'm going to be considering that, because it's really it's like a complex system, and I do tend to look at, from a systems engineering standpoint, I look at complex systems of systems, and I say, how does this system interact with this system? And this is sort of the core of how does that enterprise IT system interact with that, OT, enterprise OT. So yeah, this is a very linked problem at all levels, actually.
And I think the other one is you come back from a sort of an Intel background, and when you have that background, you kind of understand or appreciate that threat, whereas getting a layperson to appreciate the risk is the challenge as well. That normal human behavior that you're up against, I think, is the real challenge. Do you think the cybersecurity message is getting through in the OT environment? Do you think the appreciation of cybersecurity, and I use that term kind of broadly in that it's better understood in the IT environment, but in the OT, do you think it is changing there? Or do you think there not so much resistance, but we've got it and we understand our processes better? Because you mentioned at the outset, there's very few experts in this field who understand both environments intimately. I'm just wondering, the language that you see on the OT environment and the appreciation of cybersecurity, do you think you're seeing some changes there?
I definitely think there are some changes, and I think that we had 2 incidents last year that I think brought everybody's sort of attention to this, certainly in the cybersecurity community, but even lay people who were just reading the newspaper. Colonial Pipeline, the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline had a direct impact on availability of fuel, certainly where I live. I remember the evening that happened. It was a Friday evening. I actually got in my car. It was midnight. Got in my car and drove to a 24-hour gas station and filled up, because I knew what was coming. And I told my friends, I texted everybody, and I'm like, you better go get gas. And they're like, it's 12 o'clock, midnight. I don't want to go out and get gas. I'm like, trust me, go get gas. And no joke, the next day, by middle of the afternoon, most stations were empty. And this was something that was very mainstream. Everybody said, well, wait, I don't understand. How did the ransomware in the IT system affect their logistics, their transportation planning? Well, this is exactly what we're always trying to sort of tell, in a very kind way. We're always trying to tell asset owners and operators, hey, listen, you have a complex system there. It's called corporate IT, and you have another complex system there. It's called corporate OT. And those two things have touch points. Do you know where those touch points are? Are you aware of every sort of externality that could occur if one of those touch points is even changed slightly without your permission? So, and this is a difficult conversation, because you do have the cybersecurity side, and I know this from a pedagogical standpoint, because I was a professor for many years teaching cybersecurity, and then I had to teach cybersecurity engineering, and it was like, whoa, the cybersecurity people in IT, they don't know the same thing that the cybersecurity engineering people know who do OT. It's a totally different set of knowledge. And I also think that you were saying about human nature, and this is a great point. I think that people would like to believe everything's okay, right? Especially today, the world's upside down right now with the pandemic, and even though it's waning in some areas, it's still upside down, and people just want something. They can say, yeah, you know what, they got it, it's okay. But really, my question is, do they have it, and do they understand exactly what they have? And of course, Dragos comes in and says, yeah, here's a map of your assets, and here's where you're connecting to your enterprise IT, and just focus on how these things matter to OT, because we really, again, certainly from our standpoint, we're always only interested in how any of this affects the operational technology side. And the Colonial Pipeline was one example, as I mentioned. Oldsmar was another one, the Oldsmar water incident, where somebody was able to actually get on the HMI and change the concentration of sodium hydroxide in the water. Fortunately, there was a process engineer standing there watching this and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! This is a problem. I got to fix this," and fixed it before anything happened. But again, that was because the TeamViewer software was installed so that people could monitor this remotely. This was a direct impact from working remotely, you can't. One thing Dragos never does is we don't point fingers at anybody, because everybody's learning. This is a learning process for all of us, and we certainly don't. We don't have all the answers. We will, if somebody says, "Hey, can you find this for us?" We will look for those answers. But sometimes there's a lot involved in that discovery process. And I know our tireless incident response team, they go through the same thing, and they're there on site typically at these organizations, sort of dealing with the very front line of the incident. And it can be very difficult. Some organizations don't want to be told that, "Hey, you didn't really pay attention to this this IT installation here that is based on software from 2018 maybe, and it might not be secure because there might have been no patches applied," and this sort of thing. So it's a whole bunch of things that really play into this risk assessment, and it's just it can be thorny sometimes, and it's thorny for us.
I was going to say, you can't fix it all at once. You mentioned the complex systems, and they are complex. So you need to implement a sort of a program. How does a Dragos visibility tool work? Is it an agent, or is it a process that might just go to a server and find out what's connected to that server? How does it actually work at the technical level?
Yeah, it uses proprietary protocols to sort of seek out. There is a whole bunch of technology behind this. I work in the Intel side of the house, so I'm not the implementation engineer. I'm probably not the number one person to ask for this question, but certainly Dragos could provide more information on that from that side of the house. But from what I know, it does use a discovery protocol that will find the devices, the assets,
and starts to map that network for you.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yep.
Well, without that visibility, you can't do a risk assessment, really. In fact, if you have no visibility, that's your first risk identification in terms of, okay, what are we actually dealing with? And you might have a good visibility into your corporate network, but it's getting that visibility across an OT network. And we're still seeing, I'm still surprised, even brand new PLCs coming out are still seeing CVEs and patches attributed to them with some vulnerabilities. So even the modern PLCs are still found to be vulnerable at some point. So you can, as you mentioned, the 2018 or 2000s related infrastructure, and some of this infrastructure is quite old, and that's the other sort of element of the perfect storm, right? Is the age of some of this infrastructure.
And it's in the difficulty in some instances to allow downtime to actually enable the patching can be extremely complicated. And I mean, remember the devices are designed for functionality. The engineers sit down and they design something that's going to be functional. Security is, I think engineers think a lot more about it today than they did in the past.
Yeah.
But sometimes, we know how the flow of business sometimes is. You get some pressure to get it done. We know there are several major worldwide software organizations that are known to release software that has lots of bugs in it, and it's not. Nobody sits down and says, "I'm going to put a lot of bugs in this software." It's just that sometimes there's things pressuring, and that pressure sometimes exists with organizations, again, that are trying to do large scale patching. Typically with IT, they will send an announcement out and they'll say, "Yeah, we're patching the systems between 1 and 3 a.m. Eastern time, so make sure you're off." It's hard to turn somebody's power off between 1 and 3 a.m. Eastern time for any reason, really. Yeah. So that availability in the OT environment is critical for customers, and it can be very difficult, I think, to to get the patching done in a timely manner. It's a whole different sort of decision calculus.
I think the only thing what I find of interest is in moving into the future with newer systems coming on board. They tend to have a digital twin that you might be able to do some vulnerability assessments on and some scenario game playing. I think that's one aspect that hasn't been there in the past, where you can sort of understand how that system will respond or be impacted as well. Now, what's the call out? I think there's a number of papers here, and I have been looking through one in particular, was the executive guide and assessing ransomware risk in IT and OT environments. Maybe a call to action for some further reading. We've got a number of white papers, but also the outlook for 2022, Tom, and maybe in contrast to 2021. 2021 was certainly a highlight for ransomware. We did peak at some point during the year, maybe early mid-year. How do you view 2022? We've already mentioned Russia a couple of times and Ukraine, but there's certainly more. Do you expect ransomware to be maintained or certainly continue as a key risk this year or threat?
I think based on the past 2 years of looking, even 3 years of ransomware, I expect that one way or the other, it's still going to be a problem. What I'm more concerned about, though, actually in 2022, is the Log4j type vulnerabilities that, like the print nightmare vulnerability from late last spring. These are vulnerabilities that may not appear to be directly OT related, but as you start to peel the layers off the IT and you look at how IT interacts with OT, and you start to look at source code that's used in OT environments, you realize that something like Log4j could be a really big problem. So I think there's probably going to be something along those lines, because remember we had, of course, at the very end of 2020, we had SolarWinds, and that was a supply chain dilemma, certainly from a software standpoint, or at least it was delivered through supply chain. Things like Log4j, things like that supply chain delivery mechanism and ransomware, I think are going to continue to be a problem. Leaving nation states out, we never really know. Predicting what a nation state's going to do next is very difficult. I do think that if Russia keeps their promise and sends troops to Venezuela and a couple other countries, that's going to increase the risk calculus, certainly in this country. And there's always the issue of active operations inside your home country. We assume that foreign intelligence services have people in every city, in every state in the United States, in every area in Australia. I mean, they're everywhere. So yeah, we assume that this is the case. So the real question becomes, what are those, FIS is going to be focusing on? Luckily, that's less my job today to track, and I can track more of the threats to ICS and operational technology. But I think the two, there's a lot of places where those two things can connect. There's always the insider threat issue that concerns me. I do lose sleep over that, especially in the United States, knowing what I know about, sort of foreign intelligence activities in this country on a daily basis. I used to always tell my students, I'd say, where is the espionage capital of the world? And, most students would say Paris or Moscow or something like that, or Beijing. But really the answer is Washington, D.C. I live in Northern Virginia, so that's near and dear to me. That's a definite concern. But the other thing to keep in mind too, taking the big city out of this, Dragos really likes to support and help small business, small owner operators. I think those are also of to me, from my personal perspective, those are of interest. That those are things that need to be protected as well. Yeah. So it doesn't matter whether it's a gigantic grid company or whether it's a small mom and pop water purification for maybe part of a state. All of these matter, and that's the thing that I think, from my perspective, Dragos is really cool. They want to support everybody. It's not just the large companies; it's really everybody in between. So,
I would back that up. It's the second and third tier. I think again you need to look at across the supply chain, and that's where your sort of contractors and suppliers also come into that risk assessment as well. It's not just your on-facility environment either. So it's a good point to make. in terms of today's topic, in terms of a risk assessment in an ICS environment. It's that supply chain, and even if a piece of infrastructure changes or breaks, what's that supply chain to actually fix it as well? Because things tend to happen in threes during a crisis. So what we'll do is we'll put some links out here. We've got a recent ransomware attacks against government and critical infrastructure. There's a few blog posts, a couple of white papers, and also a webinar recording with you, Tom, as well. And that's Protect Your IC Environments from Ransomware with Risk Assessment. So there's going to be a number of links in the show notes. But thank you very much for your time, Tom. A pleasure talking to you today. Dr. Tom Winston, the Director of Intelligence with Dragos. Thanks very much for joining us on MySec TV.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.